Batya Ungar-Sargon. There's an audio file that gets sent to me that everyone gets sent with how to pronounce your name.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it goes in the email.
From who?
Your assistant. I don't want to get them in trouble.
I don't have an assistant.
Exactly.
It's very weird because I have many, many siblings, and none of my siblings say my last name the way that they say our last name the way I do. My parents don't say it the same, so I'm very curious to find out how it's being recommended.
It was shown as Batya Ungar-Sargon because I would have said Ungar.
Oh, interesting.
The media went from underclass to the right. We're having a giggly moment because I've just met Batya and it's been a whirlwind of fire, a baptism of fire. The media went from underclass to woke elite. How the fuck did that happen?
Okay, wait, say it again. The media went from underclass to woke elite. Yes. The history of journalism in America is very interesting because for much of the 20th century, the 19th century, journalism was produced by working class people for working class people. It was produced for the masses, and all of the business incentives and motives behind that were you should get the most amount of readers because then you'll make the most amount of money. And the way to do that is to write about things that mattered to them. So, for example, if you were a communist, in New York City in the 1920s, you would have had like 8 communist newspapers to choose from because the papers reflected where the masses were at, what kind of point of view they had. They told stories about working class people, and they gave them a real dignity in doing so, and they shaped American policy because if you were going to go against the masses, against labor, you were going to get eviscerated in the papers. Of course, there were papers for the elites. New York Times has always catered to like a more elite clientele. But overall, in general, the papers and the journalism culture was you get the most amount of readers by talking to the most amount of people, and most people are working class. And that was who journalism was produced for. And all of that started to shift kind of in the post-war era. There were cultural shifts in America happening. There were economic shifts in America happening to where the cultural elite started to really separate out from the working class geographically, economically, culturally. And as a result of this, journalists increasingly came from the elites, and their views started to increasingly reflect those leftist elites whose views are very much at odds with where the average working class person is, whether they're a liberal or a conservative. As a result, we now have a situation where the vast majority of our journalism is produced by people with ridiculous numbers of degrees like myself from ridiculous institutions where they're taught ridiculous, stupid things that have nothing to do with how to become a good journalist. And as a result of that, the media very much caters to that economic and cultural elite. And that's, I argue in my book, that's why the media is not actually characterized by being left, like I'm left. The media is woke. And wokeness is having these extremist views about race and gender and the world that are rooted in an oppressor-oppressed binary. It is totally alien to American culture. It's totally alien to the working class of all races. But it is how the elites got away with this abandonment of labor while still seeing themselves as the good guys. So in a long, that's kind of that's the story.
I can't believe how well you transitioned from joking about silly things into a really succinct and perfectly put bit about exactly what I asked, from the underclass to the woke elite. And you write that journalists are the most overeducated profession in the US. Is that like a statistic, or is it just like it seems that way?
Oh, no, that's a statistic, yeah.
How do you measure overeducatedness?
They are the most degreed, the most credentialed industry in America. And this despite the fact that for the vast majority of American history, journalists did not have a college degree. So in 1930, only a third of journalists had a college degree. Like they don't actually learn journalism when you go to journalism school.
Yeah.
These people with multiple degrees in economics, like that, how does that make you a better journalist? It doesn't. Journalism, the job is to write the first draft of American history, the great American story. And the most important thing to have in your character when you're doing that is humility. And that is the one thing that they are certain to leave an elite university situation without.
Yeah. How many, what ones do you, because you're a journalist.
I am.
What things do you have? Degree things.
What are my degrees in? You want me to list my shame?
Are they just loads of them? I'm
intrigued.
Like,
sit here and
well, okay, I've got a whole bunch of them as well.
Uh-huh.
And like some of the stuff we had to do was like shorthand. Like, you learn this different language of dots and beeps and things.
You learned that? I didn't learn that.
I had to learn that. Like,
do you use it? That sounds like a really useful skill, actually.
Well, I was going to say it's incredibly useless because we've got audio tapes, but you're not allowed to take them into court. So that's the point. You're supposed to be able to write really, really fast in the binary dots and slashes and things. But, it just, that's one of the things I think is mad. And yeah, well, I mean, how would one learn journalism? I suppose what you're saying, you learn to have some humility and reflect better the aspirations of the working person.
Yeah, I mean, just knowing what normal people think and what they want to know from people in power. Like, as journalists, we get access to people in power. And what it used to be was what we would do with that access was, okay, if you were a journalist, you came from a working class background, you came from a working class neighborhood, you saw yourself as answerable to, like, all of the guys in your class who went to work in the factory. And you couldn't go work in the factory because let's say you had a real problem with authority. Let's say you had an abusive dad. You couldn't take orders. They were like, he can't come to the factory. He's going to put everyone in danger. All right, fine. I'll go become a journalist, right? Like, that's kind of how it worked. The guy who was like always cracking wise at the teacher's expense, getting kicked out of class, like, that's the kind of person who would become a journalist. Someone who hated power and hated authority and hated people who had it and was always thinking about his friends on the line and how can I make their life better? And so he would go to Washington and they were proud of the fact that the politicians hated their guts because they were representing their working class friends and neighbors. Tate's the exact opposite. The kind of person who becomes a journalist is the kid like sitting in the front of the classroom, like every time the teacher asks a question, me, the teacher has to pretend they don't see them so other kids get a chance. They are very comfortable with authority. They go to one university and then another university where they sit there becoming teacher's pet after teacher's pet. To become a journalist is very hard now because the industry has shrunk. So the people hiring can have their pick of and instead of being like, we have 10,000 applicants, we're going to go into Appalachia or we're going to go to the inner city and find that black kid living between gang territory and bring him in to get that perspective and teach him the ropes on the job, they get the kid from Harvard because that's what they've decided to do. So who goes to Harvard? Who graduates from Harvard with 2 degrees and a degree in economics? I mean, it's like the kid in the front.
Boring.
And who loves authority, who never met an authority figure they didn't want to impress. They now live in the same neighborhoods as the billionaires and the politicians who they're supposed to be covering adversarially. Their kids go to the same fancy schools. Like, that whole adversarial mindset is gone. And there's been just a consolidation of, basically elite solidarity.
It's something particularly insidious with that happening to the left wing. I think in the UK, the Guardian, the New York Times here, I suppose, that now it's the rich, pompous, posh people like me who are going in and working for those institutions. I mean, they shouldn't have me because I am from a posh background. They shouldn't have me, except for the fact that I hate authoritarianism and authority and things like that. But they should have people, as you say, who actually reflect the views of the people there. It's disgusting, actually, the more I think about it. That there's all these sort of posh, rich people going to work for these ultra left-wing newspapers and then taking the focus away from working class people.
It's so much worse than that because what they've done is it's so gross, but they create an ideology that allowed them to plunder the middle class, right? The top 20% now, these over-credentialed college elites now control over 50% of the GDP in America. So they've plundered the middle class while pretending that they are the good guys on the side of justice. And you can go down the list of priorities of the average New York Times writer. First of all, it's totally obvious what side they're on in every situation. But in every single case, they are masquerading as the good guys on the side of justice while actually making the lives of working class Americans of all races infinitely worse.